Welcome back to video 5 of the Gull Guides featured highlight series, May 2025. Last time we explained when and how a gull begins its second molt cycle, and we learned this usually occurs at about 10 to 12 months old with the start of the second prebasic molt. This molt is typically signaled by the start of flight feather molt. We'll notice some molt gap in the inner primaries, and that to us is a signal that the next prebasic molt has begun. So we went through plates 31 through 34, and we noted some of these June, August birds in flight feather molt. And by September, October, on these second cycles, most of the flight feathers have grown in. And a bird like this on plate 34 is a second basic California gull now in late September. So to continue with this notion of when does a molt cycle begin, in this video, I'd like to walk you through the transition from second molt cycle to third molt cycle. And the question we're asking today is, what does this process from second cycle to third cycle involve? What are the main plumage differences that we can expect when distinguishing second cycle and third cycle individuals? If we look at this table 3 from page 17, we want to focus particularly on 4-cycle gulls. And the reason for this is by the time these 2-cycle and 3-cycle birds are in third basic plumage, they've pretty much assumed an adult-like appearance, and we can stop worrying about aging them. We simply refer to them as adults at this point. We might make a distinction of adult basic, adult alternate, but overall, we really can't distinguish a third cycle Bonaparte's from a 10th cycle Bonaparte's, or a third cycle ring build, say, from a 5th cycle ring build. There might be some subtle features that look subadult-like, but overall, without life history, it's difficult to pin down third cycle with these type of species. The nitty-gritty of aging, when we talk about second cycle to third cycle, revolves around 4-cycle species. And a good example of this is American herring gull. This seems to be our quintessential 4-cycle gull in North America. So I think we'll use it here as our model for aging second and third cycle birds. Let's begin with this individual in January in Atlantic Canada. I have it here aged as a second cycle, and it looks fairly delayed, but this is quite a common appearance on the Atlantic. Their second cycle birds can show some barring on the scapulars, but they often don't have solid gray backs. So if you're wondering why isn't it a first cycle, well, I do see a paling iris here, and that can help with the aging. An American herring first cycle, we usually don't expect a pale iris in January, right? A bird that's 6-7 months old should have a dark eye. But plumage-wise, the greater coverts are very plain, and I do see some solid gray on the centers of these upper scapulars and the mantle here. So that solid gray should exclude a first cycle in January. And after a while, you do start to get a feel for these primary tips. They're just not the sharp, pointy tips that we see on first-generation primaries. And, it is somewhat subtle and difficult for some people to pick up on that. But these are overall rounded tips to the primaries, and not those sharp, pointy first-generation primaries. Okay, so in flight, a bird like this might appear very muted and plain on the upper parts. In November, I'm noticing the white upper tail coverts here, so that is going to exclude a first cycle. Also, there is a paling iris. I'm not sure if you can make that out, but the subtle gray on the back, the white upper tail coverts, and pale iris here are very good for second cycle. And now, with this bird, I'm intentionally leaving out the molt cycle. And if you saw this open wing on American herring gull in March, would you call it a second or third cycle? The key feature to hone in on is the appearance of the trailing edge here on these secondaries and inner primaries. I want you to compare those to this bird here. And so with third generation, third cycle flight feathers, there should be broad white tips, and this often continues on to the inner primaries. And not only that, the centers to these primaries are gray, adult-like, and the centers to these secondaries are gray and adult-like. Now, it doesn't have to be continuous gray. There could be some blotting and spotting and brown and black pigment, but the broad white tips to those secondaries and inner primaries make this a pretty safe third cycle type. Of course, we'd never call this an adult with black on the tail and black on the primary coverts. It is a third cycle American herring, and the P10 mirror here just supports that. Back to this individual here. Again, I'm not seeing any broad white tips to these flight feathers. I'm not seeing adult-like gray centers. And so in March, the gray back on a perched bird might give you the impression of a second cycle. And so a bird like this you would want to see an open wing for. But the gray scapulars are very likely second alternate. These flight feathers here are second basic. All right. More aging here. Perched bird, this is March in British Columbia. And the question is second cycle or third cycle. And the primaries here with white apicals at the tips. The broad white tertial tips, the broad white secondary tips. These are the secondaries here drooping below the greater coverts. And so overall, there's no reason to suspect second cycle here. This is a third cycle. And third cycles tend to pull to adult. Second cycles very often tend to pull towards first cycle. So that's generally how we teach fourth cycle gulls. You're comparing second cycles are overall more brown overall. They're greater coverts, they're tertials perhaps, resembling more of a first cycle appearance. And third cycles, especially later in the non-breeding season, look more and more adult-like. Now, adults wouldn't show all this pigment on the lower belly. They wouldn't show dark tertials, and certainly not a black tail as we see in this individual. So third cycle it is. Back to Atlantic Canada in the winter. The question here is second cycle or third cycle American herring. You know, the bill pattern and eye here are completely useless for aging. This could be the head of a second cycle. It could be the head of a third cycle. That bill pattern and eye color is highly variable. Focus on the primaries here, and we notice these white apicals on black primaries. That's a more of an adult-like feature, and so we're going to pull third cycle here. And the P10 mirror on the underside of this far wing, this P10 mirror also supports third cycle. So what is happening with this bird's tertials? Why are they so delayed? And why are the greater coverts so delayed? These are just third basic feathers, and it's not unusual to have that appearance, especially on the Atlantic coast. And so in blue here, the median coverts, this whole track here, and these scapulars, and maybe even the upper tertials here, may be third alternate, right? And so this third pre-alternate molt, just like other pre-alternate molts we said, are kind of protracted in large gulls. They kick on in the fall, they do their thing, maybe some head feathers, some coverts, scapulars, and then they oftentimes will just suspend over the non-breeding season or are very slow paced and then kick on again in late winter, early spring. And so that's what might have happened here with this bird's median coverts and scapulars. We can attribute them to the third pre-alternate molt. The question here is it a second or third cycle? January, Florida, we focus on these primaries. We see no white apicals, and that doesn't seem to be due to wear. Sometimes on P8, P9, white apicals will be lost due to wear, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. We have these plain second basic like greater coverts and tertials. We're certainly not seeing gray adult-like centers with broad white tips. And so a bird like this, to safely age, I would want to see the inner primaries, and I did see this bird's open wing, and it is, in fact, a second cycle American herring. Again, the feature here is, what do the primaries look like? Any indication of white tips on the tips to the secondaries or even the tertials, and it's no, no, no for all three of those, so second cycle it is. So the molt from second cycle to third cycle is the third prebasic molt, and you'll notice in this July bird, photographed by Liam Singh on Vancouver Island, the third generation flight feathers are really obvious. They have these broad white tips with adult-like gray centers. So these are third basic, produced by the third prebasic molt. And the contrast, especially in darker back species like Western and Great Blackback, the contrast is really noticeable. And so you're going to be noticing this now at this time of year. Certainly by June, you'll see these darker inner primaries with white tips. And you'll notice this contrast with second generation flight feathers, second generation secondaries and outer primaries, and even the tail feathers. Now, there are some species, Western Gull being a good example, in their second basic plumage, the tips to these secondaries can have fairly broad white tips, and when they're perched, that drooping secondary skirt might suggest an adult-like appearance, and you might suspect it's third cycle. But they have naturally broad white tips. What they lack are gray centers to those feathers. And so we're seeing a lot of brown here on both webs, and it's not this adult-like appearance. So despite the white tips to these secondaries, they don't have adult-like gray centers to those secondaries, and so those are second basic feathers. All right. I do want to save this bird as a quiz at the end, so we'll come back and circle to this to close out the video. But right now, let's look at a couple of lesser blackback gulls. And the question is, second cycle or third cycle, what are our thoughts on aging these two? Give you some context. I photographed these birds in southwest Portugal, and it would be late December, January. Starting with the bird on the right, we do have a third cycle type. And some people might conclude this is an adult, mainly based on the solid dark upper parts here. But notice the bill pattern and the leg color. Certainly not yellow legs as we expect in these older, lesser blackbacks. What will happen with these birds in the non-breeding season, these third cycle types, they'll often take on this regressive bill pattern where almost, the basal 3/4 of the bill becomes black with just a yellow tip. So it's thought that this happens regularly with second and third cycle types, that the bill pattern is regressive. But again, the question of, is it a second cycle? No. With the white apicals on these black primaries, the white tips and dark adult-like black centers. If we zoom in even here on these secondaries, we're seeing these white tips here. Very, very thin white tips. It's certainly not noticeable as you would notice it in like a Western Gull or slatyback gull. But on the left here, beside this bird being a known age bird, I reported this individual, and it is in fact a second cycle. Focusing on the primaries, We don't see any white apicals here, and that's not due to wear. There's been no time for wear. These are fairly new primaries. It is a fairly advanced third cycle. It has, or excuse me, second cycle. It does have fairly solid gray upper parts here, but we see these second basic lesser coverts. They're frayed and older. And these in blue here, these feathers are likely second alternate. And what will happen in a lot of these lesser blackback gulls is they'll replace some tertials. They'll take on an adult appearance with white tips. They might even replace some tail feathers, but we suspect these are second alternate. And looking very closely, you can even see some older greater coverts here, those barred second basic greater coverts. With a bird like this, it's always fun to see the open wing and make sure the inner primaries are not adult-like. I'm going to erase all these markings here and just take these individuals in again. The eye color here, again, is not very useful. There are second cycles that have very pale eyes. Of course, it becomes less and less likely that a third cycle would have dark eyes in things like lesser blackback and herring gulls. By third cycle, their eyes are noticeably yellow, but that doesn't work the other way around. A dark eye does not necessarily mean second cycle because some second cycles do have pale eyes. Okay, we'll go back to our bird in flight here, and we'll close out with this individual, second or third cycle. And the key feature that we're going to focus on always are the inner primaries and the appearance to the tips of the secondaries. And if you guessed third cycle here, it is a third cycle type. The small P10 mirror, again, is a subtle clue that it's more likely a third cycle. And if you look at the underside of the far wing, you can see the entire mirror on P10 here. It's fairly broad, and that coupled with the adult-like inner primaries lead me to believe that this is a third cycle. If you zoom in on the inner primaries here, these mid-primaries, they did have what look like white apicals that are probably suffering from some wear. They're white feathers, and so they wear easily in comparison to dark-tipped feathers. But I do see some white here, even on P8, P9, when zooming in. So third cycle American herring with delayed greater coverts. There's like zero gray on these greater coverts. And so when perched, this would be an interesting bird to age because you're not necessarily seeing the inner primaries here. But you would hopefully see some broad white tips to the secondaries and maybe even detect the underside of P10 as this bird is perched. Okay, that's going to end this video, video 5, on distinguishing second cycle and third cycle gulls. Just keep in mind this is a question that pertains to 4 cycle species and not so much for 2 and 3 cycle species. Next time in video 6 in June, we'll start looking at some adult IDs and trying to distinguish species that have overlapping patterns in their plumages and help identify some birds based on context and time of year. Thanks for watching. Again, if you have any suggestions or comments you'd like to leave me, you can email me at thegullguide@gmail.com. We'll see you guys in June.